Welcome to Brandon Hall Group's HCMx Radio, the only podcast in the HCM arena that weaves current market research, HR technology, and industry leaders into each episode. Our HCMx Radio host is our Chief Operating Officer and Principal HCM Analyst, Rachel Cook.
Hi, this is Rachel Cook. I'm the COO and the host of Brandon Hall Group's HCMx podcast. Thank you everyone for listening in. I am excited today, and I'd like to warmly welcome our guest on today's episode, Betsy Geller, who is a Senior Learning Consultant at Conduent. Welcome, Betsy.
Thank you, Rachel.
And also joining us is Dave Wentworth, our Principal Learning Analyst from Brandon Hall Group. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you. Always a good time.
Yes, indeed. And today we are actually regrouping and continuing a discussion that you and Betsy led recently on a webinar around immersive learning and virtual reality, as well as augmented reality. And so for those of you that may or may not know Betsy, just a little bit about her background. She is a Senior Learning Consultant at Conduent, and she works with clients to help define learning strategies and solutions, and with project teams to build these solutions. She's very passionate about the use of technology, simulations, learning games, and other approaches. And I'm gonna, just Betsy, we were just chatting before, and I find your background fascinating and interesting. So I'd love for you to share a little bit to our listeners today about you and what you are so passionate about.
Well, thanks, Rachel. Yeah, I really love the immersive learning experience and the experiential learning experience. And I have been involved in immersive learning even before there was technology for it. I was involved in immersive language learning, both as a learner, immersing myself in different cultures, and as a teacher, teaching both overseas and in a program in the US, where our learners were just dropped into a situation and fully enveloped in the language. So my passion for immersive learning and experiential learning goes far back, even before the use of these technologies. I also am very passionate about this sort of hands-on 3D experience, and I teach dance in my spare time, which is a very 3D immersive experience, even in person.
That's great. And Dave, you have a little bit of that art background as well with your bands. You are when he's moonlighting with Brandon Hall Group, he's a rock star.
Very liberal use of that term, but yeah, I am a musician, and it's funny to think about these ideas of immersive learning and practical learning, and trying to imagine learning to play an instrument by just watching hours of videos but never picking up the instrument, and then suddenly deciding how to play. I don't think it works that way.
I think that's also what makes instructors or consultants or those that are helping the learners apply the information and the structure. When you are creative and have a creative background, I think you add so much more to the richness and the context of the experience. I see that a lot with Dave and the research that we do, and I'm hearing from you, Betsy, and the work that you do at Conduent. So let's talk a little bit about defining virtual reality and augmented reality. Who'd like to go first there? Betsy?
Sure, I'll start. Well, virtual reality is an artificial environment. It's created by software, and it's typically multi-sensory and 3D. It's an environment that the user can actually enter and walk around or navigate or explore 3D objects by rotating them or changing their scale. And it might be designed for use with a special VR headset, or it could even be what's called a monoscopic VR designed for use on a tablet. So there's a little less functionality, but it can still be called virtual reality.
Is the type of equipment needed? Would you say, as you kind of look where the market is maturing, do you find it easier for the average training professional to be able to have access to this type of equipment than you would say a few years ago even?
Yeah, I would say that some of the specialized equipment is still expensive and it still requires some management, but the tools for managing it are becoming easier. But what is becoming easier is that the development platforms are becoming more user-friendly, and there are some more template platforms.
Mm-hmm. Oh, great.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's sort of the real tipping point here. I mean, people have been talking about virtual reality for decades, but I think, beyond just the bandwidth and the equipment, I think that's the tipping point. There is the ability for people who are not necessarily software developers to start to be able to create these experiences in these environments. And that's, I think been a big roadblock to this point, is when we start to talk about creating something like a VR experience, companies think that it's some sort of huge, massive software project that's going to require tons of experts to build. And we're actually seeing that a lot of companies and providers are building tools that are allowing people with not as a lot of development experience to create these.
What do you see as the uptake in our research from the percentage of organizations that have this type of application?
Yeah, it's still, I mean, in the grand scheme of learning in general, it's still pretty small. Even though we've been talking about it since the 80s, it's still pretty slow on the uptake, but it's increasing. And I think what's most surprising, anyway, to me, is our most recent ask on this. We were asking organizations what types of technologies they had, or what they're going to be adding in the next couple of years. And while only, around 6% of companies are using VR today, about 40-something percent, 41% or so, say that they plan to add it. So clearly an appetite. People are recognizing there's a lot of different applications for this kind of technology. So I think the momentum is greater than it has been in even just recent years.
And probably even more so now that we have so many more people that are working from home and really need to kind of simulate that learning experience greater than ever before. Betsy, for those that do indicate that there is a high level of interest in implementing or developing this type of solution, what are your recommendations? What are the things that they need to be thinking about? How can they get started? What are the things that are critical at the very beginning, and how would you recommend the most effective way for them to do so?
Well, they really need to think about what specifically they're using these modalities for. You remember we have both virtual reality and augmented reality. And, with virtual reality, you're looking at a truly immersive experience, but you want to think about, as with any learning project, what are my learning objectives? With virtual reality, you're looking at building more than with augmented reality. So you are looking at probably creating short experiences for the learner. There's a potential for motion sickness and some other things still, though that's getting better with new equipment. But we want to think about a very short, focused skill practice, whether that's a hands-on skill or a people skill.
Okay. So do they have to take Dramamine to use these equipment, or?
That's a great question. And the answer is no. I mean, there might be a rare individual out there that gets a little disoriented. There are a couple of things that we find are useful, and that is that really designing the experience so that it's focused on the learning objectives. When you first put on a VR headset, it can be a little disorienting. And if you have to do a lot of navigation, like say around a large virtual room, it can be difficult. So we want to make sure that we limit the need for those extra actions. And we also want to provide the learner with a short tutorial on how to use the feature.
And, I've seen also programs where, for example, some of the retail stores that sell mobile devices, so they reenact these very life-threatening situations, whereas if they're in the store and they were being robbed, and take them through that simulated environment and what they should do. So it's really interesting, not to, the overall experience, and for them to feel like it's I've heard stories where they really have to kind of mentally prepare for it, and then afterwards they have these these moments of just that shock, and you want to do that so that you're preparing them. But it's fascinating how real that these solutions can appear. And Conduent has been recognized for some of these great examples in the client work that you've been doing. Are there some other examples that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I guess specifically, there's been a lot of talk about using these modalities for hands-on processes, like in equipment maintenance or manufacturing, but specifically soft skills is a great use. Really, you can put the learner into a situation or into somebody else's shoes. One example that we built is a sales training that actually uses, it has 3 levels that the learner can complete it at, and it's a branching conversation. And the learner is an avatar in the virtual room, and then the clients are also avatars, and the VR reacts and shows the avatar based on the learner's eye tracking and head motion, and then the clients also have that body language, and the VR module interacts based on the learner's language, and there's some natural language interpretation. There's also some data tracking that's going on, so we can track, kind of every response the learner makes.
And I think those example that you're bringing up, it's important because my thing with this is I really want organizations to stop thinking of this as science fiction, and when they think of virtual reality, they start thinking of interplanetary environments and spaceship, which is great, and you can do that and be engaging. But the reality is you can really get into some real hands-on skills, just like you were describing. Or we do a lot of work with inclusion and diversity, and I've seen examples of VR where you're able to put somebody literally in someone else's shoes, like you mentioned. So someone who is not a person of color can go through this scenario as a person of color or someone of a different gender and see what these experiences are like from that perspective, and it's a great way to sort of show you some of the principles that are being taught in these diversity inclusion programs, and actually put them into practice and see what they're like. And I think some of those are, even though they sound very day-to-day and mundane compared to what you can do with the technologies, I think that's where the real use is going to be for organizations.
And it's endless what you can do. You can use them for pilots, you can use them for sales, you can use them for retail stores that have to deal with theft and being able to protect their employees the best that they can. And so some of these programs are really for life-threatening skills and preparation for that, for leadership development, to help them, through practicing through tough conversations, whether it's coaching your employees or it could be, just endless what these can be used for. And what's really great is you're creating a safe environment where they can practice, and they they don't make the mistake if they're practicing in person, where it could be detrimental to the business. So the more that that you can put people through this, whether it's employees, managers, leaders, it's going to be very helpful for the organization.
Yeah, I've also seen it used in the medical environment for teaching things like bedside manner, patient interaction, and also another example of putting somebody in the learner, or putting the learner in someone else's shoes, to show a medical provider what it's like to have a certain debilitating condition. I think this is a really fascinating use of it.
Yeah, it's the modern way of role playing. because I remember when I started out in sales, it was all about role playing, and and then, you get feedback from your peers, your manager, but I think it's just another, it's fascinating to get this feedback from a avatar that is built based on human development, but it's also so much programming and science behind it, not necessarily just a personal opinion or perspective. So I think it adds another layer of sophistication and science and psychology behind it.
And there are some very lifelike avatars that are available out there that are almost kind of like templated avatars.
Yeah, and I think that's what the point to me of this is. It's not really about the technology. It's about the immersiveness. It's about the immersion in the learning. Betsy, you mentioned how earlier you had done language learning, immersive language learning, and as long as I can remember, I've always heard the best way to learn a language is if you get dropped in that country, and you have to make it literally be immersed in the country, in the culture, and you'll learn. So it's strange to me how it's taken us so long to apply that sort of immersion theory to other types of learning. And granted, we don't mean, as far as like, let's train you on customer service, we're not going to throw you into a live customers example, because that could be detrimental, as Rachel was mentioning. But the idea of, you can't expect that people are going to learn their best just by presenting the material to them and saying, here it is, do it that way when you go back to work. But if we can immerse people in these experiences so they get the feel for it, for how to actually apply the knowledge, how it actually works, what can go wrong, how to fix that, and basically have to get your way through it like you would in a real live immersive language situation. It's just taken us a long time to realize that we can do that. And again, it's not about the technology, it's not about the sci-fi of it, it's about how do we put people as best we can into these experiences that we're trying to get them to perform well in, and do it in a way that is safe for them, good for the business, so forth.
Well, what is the rule that 10,000 hours, 10 years equals for you to become an expert? And that philosophy was what presented how many years ago, when we didn't have these types of technology. So I think the use of this technology expedites that process when it's done more frequently, because you don't truly become an expert or familiar with an area until you have had that experience. And sometimes it takes many years for you to become really good at something, because you have to fail. You have to learn by something not going quite as expected. And so, not to say that, with doing or going through an immersive program like this, you're not going to have some failures, but I'm sure a lot less than you normally would have had.
I think one thing's important is that these technologies can be built so that you can fail safely, and then you can get feedback. And so you can get feedback within the VR or augmented, virtual reality or augmented reality. And then it's really great to also have a human element, like a debrief after that. So we like to see these as part of a blended learning program. And this is really the application.
Yeah,
and,
one of the things, Betsy, that you and I talked about, I think is important. I'd like to ask you about this. Is I'm always very focused on learning measurement, and companies are very challenged by how do we measure learning. And for the most part, everyone's just sort of measuring completions and smile sheets. So some companies are saying, okay, I put out this training and this many people finished it. That's the measurement. Now, I think what's great about these technologies is you can measure so many things along the way as people are actually doing the thing that they're supposed to be doing. You can actually track that and measure that, have the data. Have you seen that be put into use in some of these experiences?
Yes, and in fact, we did that with the sales training VR that I had talked about. There's a great deal of data being captured in that, so that's a great example. It's both how the learner responds, and it's also the learner's actions that would be so hard to track otherwise. So where their eyes are focused and their body language. And so then we can track that and see how that individual learner is doing. And we can also aggregate that data and get much better insight into the effectiveness our training, we can also use that data to tweak the training to make a new version that's going to be even more productive.
Well, that's great. And is there anything else that you'd like to leave our listeners today with? I think we're coming close to the end of our episode here, and there's lots of great information and examples that both of you have shared. Is there anything that you'd like to recommend for our listeners?
Well, I just want to touch on augmented reality, which we didn't really go into. And what that is, it's very similar to virtual reality, but it's different in that instead of being in an artificial environment, the user is seeing a view of the real world, typically through a device camera, and they've got an overlay of digital information or virtual objects. So you can really use that to show them more information about their environment. You can use that in terms of both training and performance support. So I just wanted to make sure that I mentioned that too.
We've seen some cool things on the performance support side of that, where a technician will be looking at a piece of equipment and through either their goggles or through a device, and the important information about that piece of equipment, what they should do, the next steps for this particular piece of maintenance will be laid out over it. And they'll even have, on top of that, a little in the corner, they can have a coach or a supervisor there that can communicate back to them if they have any questions, all while they're working on the actual piece of equipment.
Yeah, that was a really neat application of it, where they're climbing up the ladder of the telephone pole, and these jobs are also can be dangerous. They, there's a lot that they have to do, and they have to be very quick to make some of these decisions, and also make sure that they're safe while they are managing, their surroundings and so forth. But watching the person going through this augmented reality application, you felt like you were there with them. It was so real.
Yeah, I think just this idea of being able to practice a skill and have the information you need right there with you in your field of vision, and being able to do it hands-on, but in a safe environment. It's just a whole other level of learning effectiveness. It's
Betsy, are you getting pushback from any of your clients that are not ready yet to try this out? And if so, why?
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting question, Rachel. I think that we approach this fairly gently with clients. We suggest it where we think it's useful. We're not pushing it as in a heavy-handed way, obviously. I think one of the issues is time to develop. Very often clients come to us with a really a need for something with a fast turnaround. And then there's also just the deployment issue. If they need to have specialized equipment for a lot of, for many people.
Sure. And their readiness, right? The ability to prioritize around all the learning needs. So, I do see the trend as we progress here, mature, how this will increase in how organizations, just like other methodologies, have taken a little bit of time in the beginning, and then it becomes just another one of their, kind of must-have.
Yeah, I think they're still getting used to the idea of this, and that this is really feasible. And they're still learning and listening about where this is going to be the most useful.
If our listeners today have any questions or would like to reach you for some more information about the solutions that you are building, how can they find you?
I'm at betsy.geller@conduent.com, and I'm also on LinkedIn. They can connect to me.
And we will also, for those that are listening in, we do have a white paper and a past webinar that both of you have presented on. So there's a lot of great information and additional takeaways that you can find through our membership and the research that we developed with Conduent. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at any time at www.brandonhall.com or email us at success@brandonhall.com. And Dave, anything else that you'd like to share?
No, I'm fascinated by this stuff. I love seeing the demos of some of the cool things that companies are doing with these technologies. There's some pretty amazing stuff out there from a technological standpoint to a subject matter standpoint. So it's pretty fascinating to me.
Yes, absolutely. And we're just getting ready to wrap up or announce our award winners, and so we're starting to see a lot of cool applications there, and the great work that Conduent's team has done over the years and continues to do so. We again, it was great to have you on our episode today, Betsy, and we look forward to continuing the discussion. So thank you. Stay safe, stay healthy, everybody, and thank you, Dave.
Yep. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Betsy.
You both. It's great to be here.